For roughly 300,000 years, our species woke up each morning without a schedule. There were no clocks, no calendars, no deadlines carved into stone. The sun moved across the sky, and we moved with it. For 97% of the time that anatomically modern humans have existed on this planet, we lived in small, mobile groups, hunting, gathering, resting, talking, watching the stars. We built no cities, we planted no fields. We left behind almost nothing but bones, stones, yes, and the faintest traces of fire. And yet, this was not emptiness. This was not waiting. This was the longest chapter of the human story. And for most of that chapter, our ancestors were doing something that the modern world has almost entirely forgotten how to do. They were living. The popular imagination paints a grim picture. Cavemen, the word itself carries a kind of contempt. Hunched, grunting, barely surviving in a hostile wilderness, constantly on the edge of starvation, at dying young and violently. It is one of the most persistent myths in our collective understanding of the past, and it is almost entirely wrong. To understand what daily life actually looked like for our ancestors, we need to first understand the world they inhabited. Between roughly 300,000 and 12,000 years ago, the period we loosely call the Paleolithic, our species spread across nearly every landmass on Earth. From the tropical forests of Central Africa to the frozen steppe of Northern Europe, from the coastal fringes of Southeast Asia to the deserts of Australia, human beings adapted to an astonishing range of environments. But they did so with a remarkably consistent social structure: the band. A typical forager band numbered between 20 and 50 individuals. These were not strangers thrown together by circumstance. They were kin, parents, children, aunts, cousins, grandparents, bound by blood, is by marriage, and by a web of reciprocal obligation that had been refined over hundreds of generations. The band moved together, ate together, slept within arm's reach of one another. Privacy, as we understand it, did not exist, but neither did loneliness. Several bands, usually between 5 and 20, formed a wider network, what anthropologists call a tribe or ethno-linguistic group, numbering anywhere from 500 to 2,000 people. These larger networks were critical. They provided marriage partners, shared information about distant resources, and offered a safety net during lean seasons. Gatherings between bands, seasonal meetups at reliable water sources or abundant hunting grounds, were major social events. Alliances were renewed, stories were exchanged. Young people met potential partners from outside their immediate family. The forager world was small in daily scope, but vast in its web of connections. The landscape around them was not hostile. It was home. Every ridge, every water source, every seasonal fruit tree was known, named, cataloged in an oral encyclopedia, passed from generation to generation. A forager in the Kalahari today can identify over 300 plant species and knows the precise month each one fruits. A forager in the Australian outback can navigate hundreds of kilometers using songlines, oral maps encoded in narrative and music. The cognitive demands of this knowledge were immense. A single forager carried in their head a botanical database, a topographic survey, a seasonal calendar, a pharmacological reference, and a bestiary, all without a single written word. This was not ignorance. This was mastery of an entirely different kind. And hidden within this mastery was something that would only become visible thousands of years later, when anthropologists began living alongside the last surviving forager societies and measuring, for the first time, how they actually spent their days. What they found overturned everything. In the 1960s, anthropologist Richard Lee conducted one of the most influential field studies in the history of the discipline. He spent years living with the Jew/Hwanzi people of the Kalahari Desert in southern Africa, one of the last groups on Earth still practicing a fully foraging lifestyle. He tracked their activities hour by hour, day by day. The results were staggering. The average Jew/Hwanzi adult spent between 4 and 6 hours per day on activities related to subsistence, hunting, gathering, and food preparation. The rest of the day was spent resting, socializing, playing, napping, and telling stories. In a good season, the number dropped even further. Some days, the total work involved walking to a known mongongo grove, filling a bag, and walking back. 2 hours. The caloric return from mongongo nuts alone could sustain an adult for an entire day with minimal effort. Lee called it the original affluent society. This was not an anomaly. Similar studies among the Hadza of Tanzania, the Aboriginal Australians, and the Ashe of Paraguay confirmed the same broad pattern. Forager work hours were consistently shorter than those of agricultural societies, industrial workers, or modern office employees. The average medieval peasant worked longer hours. The average American works longer hours. A factory worker in 1850s Manchester worked 6 days a week, 14 hours a day. A modern knowledge worker averages 8 to 10 hours of scheduled work, plus commuting, errands, and domestic labor. The Jiu Huanzi had none of these. Their economy was immediate, their needs were met, and their surplus was measured not in grain or gold, but in time. The key was the environment's generosity, or, more precisely, the forager's deep understanding of how to exploit that generosity with minimal effort. A skilled Hadza hunter could bring down enough meat in a single successful hunt to feed the camp for days. The women who gathered and gathering provided the majority of calories in most forager societies, between 60% and 80%, knew exactly where to go and when. There was no wasted motion, no speculative planting, no anxious waiting for a harvest months away. The landscape was a pantry, and they knew every shelf. Yeah, the idea that our ancestors spent every waking moment in a desperate struggle for survival is, by the data, simply false. But what did they do with all that time? The answer begins with talking. Human beings are, above all else, a social species. And in a forager band, social life was not a luxury. It was infrastructure. Alliances had to be maintained. Conflicts had to be resolved before they fractured the group. Knowledge had to be transmitted. Decisions about where to move, when to hunt, and how to distribute food were made collectively through long conversations around the fire. The campfire was the center of forager life. Anthropologist Polly Wiesner studied fire-lit conversations among the Jiu Huanzi and found that daytime talk was overwhelmingly practical. Who saw what? Where to go next? Who owed what to whom? But at night, by the fire, the conversation transformed. Over 80% of nighttime talk was storytelling. Myths, legends, accounts of hunts, jokes, imitations, moral tales. The fire extended the social day by several hours, and those hours were dedicated almost entirely to narrative. We were telling stories long before we invented writing. The campfire was our first theater. Children were not separated from this world. There were no schools, no age-segregated institutions, no formal instruction. Children learned by watching, by imitating, by playing. And play, among forager children, was remarkably free. The studies of Hadza and Juhuanzi children show that they spent the vast majority of their waking hours in mixed-age playgroups with almost no adult supervision or direction. They climbed, they ran, they pretended to hunt, they built miniature shelters, they practiced with small bows. The skills of adult life were absorbed gradually, through a freedom that most modern children would find unrecognizable. Conflict, when it arose, was handled with a set of tools that prioritized group cohesion above individual victory. Ridicule was a common leveling mechanism. Any hunter who boasted about a kill was mocked relentlessly until he downplayed his success. Anthropologists call this leveling behavior, and it served a critical function. It prevented the accumulation of power. In a band of 30 people, a single dominant individual could tear the group apart. The social technology to prevent this was not law, it was laughter. Sharing was not optional. It was the foundational ethic of forager life. Meat, the most prized and variable resource, was distributed according to strict customary rules, typically by the person who owned the arrow that killed the animal, not the hunter who shot it. This seemingly arbitrary system was, in fact, a sophisticated mechanism for distributing obligation across the group. The arrow's owner might be an elderly woman who had not hunted in years. And the system ensured that even those who could no longer contribute physically remained embedded in the economy of reciprocity. Hoarding wasn't merely frowned upon, it was socially annihilated. And if the social pressure became unbearable, if a conflict grew too deep to resolve through mockery or mediation, there was always the ultimate forager solution. You could leave. A disgruntled family could simply walk away and join another band within their broader network. That freedom was measured in distance. This exit option, unavailable in later agricultural and urban societies where land, property, and hierarchy locked people in place, was perhaps the single most powerful check on tyranny that any human society has ever possessed. While the social world demanded constant attention, the material world demanded skill. Our ancestors were not crude. They were, by any reasonable standard, master craftspeople operating under severe constraints. A Homo sapiens napper, working a core of flint 40,000 years ago, was executing a sequence of precise, planned strikes that required an understanding of fracture mechanics, grain structure, and three-dimensional geometry. A single Acheulean hand axe, the kind our ancestors produced for over 1 million years, required dozens of sequential blows, each one calibrated to the outcome of the last. Mistakes were irreversible. There was no undo. Fire management was equally sophisticated. Maintaining a fire through a wet season, transporting embers during a migration, knowing which woods burned slow and hot versus fast and bright. These were not trivial skills. Fire was cooking, warmth, protection from predators, and a social gathering point. Losing it could be catastrophic. The knowledge of how to start and sustain fire was arguably the single most important technical skill in the Paleolithic toolkit. And the evidence suggests it was old. Hearth sites at Gesher Beno Yaakov in Israel date to nearly 800,000 years ago, long before our species even existed. Clothing, where climate demanded it, was stitched from animal hides using bone needles. Some of the earliest found date to 60,000 years ago. The eyed needle, a seemingly humble invention, required drilling a hole through a sliver of bone no wider than a matchstick. It was precision engineering at the millimeter scale, and it unlocked the ability to create fitted, layered garments capable of sustaining human life in subarctic conditions. Without the needle, we could not have colonized the north. Shelters ranged from simple windbreaks to elaborate huts built from mammoth bones on the open steppe of what is now Ukraine. At the site of Measurable, archaeologists uncovered a structure made from the bones of at least 95 mammoths, arranged in a circular pattern, dating to roughly 15,000 years ago. 95 mammoths. The logistics of acquiring, transporting, and assembling that quantity of bone suggest planning, coordination, and architectural ambition that the word primitive cannot begin to accommodate. These were not caves, these were engineered spaces. The body that performed all of this work was, by most measurable standards, healthier than the body that replaced it. Skeletal analysis of pre-agricultural humans consistently shows tall stature, strong bones, good dental health, and relatively few signs of chronic disease. The average male forager stood between 5 feet 8 inches and 5 feet 10 inches, a height that European populations would not recover until the 20th century. Their teeth, subjected to almost no refined carbohydrates, show wear from grit and hard food, but remarkably few cavities. A modern dentist examining a 30,000-year-old jaw would find less decay than in the average contemporary teenager. Their diet was varied, nutrient-dense, and seasonal. Wild game, fish, shellfish, its tubers, fruits, nuts, seeds, honey, insects, eggs. Over 100 different food sources in a typical annual cycle. No single staple dominated. No single crop failure could produce famine. Protein intake was high. Fiber intake was enormous, estimated at 100 grams per day, compared to roughly 15 grams in the modern Western diet. Micronutrient diversity was vastly superior to any single crop agricultural system. The forager body was lean, strong, and adapted to sustained low-intensity movement, punctuated by bursts of high effort. The diseases that would come to define later human existence, cavities, anemia, tuberculosis, smallpox, were largely absent. They required the density of agricultural settlements to thrive. Death, of course, was present. Infant mortality was high. Perhaps 30 to 40% of children did not survive to age 5. Violence, snake bites, infections, falls, any complications in childbirth. These were real and constant risks. But those who survived childhood had a reasonable chance of reaching 60 or even 70. The notion that prehistoric humans universally died at 30 is a statistical illusion, created by averaging high infant death rates into overall life expectancy. A healthy adult forager who made it past childhood was not old at 35. They were in the prime of life. But perhaps the most surprising discovery of all lies not in the stomach or the skeleton, but in the mind. Deep inside the caves of southern France and northern Spain, in chambers so remote that reaching them required crawling through narrow passages in total darkness, our ancestors left behind some of the most haunting images ever created. At Chauvet, horses and lions rendered with anatomical precision and a sense of movement that would not be matched for another 30,000 years. At Lascaux, a vast panorama of aurochs, deer, and abstract symbols painted in ochre and charcoal across nearly 600 images. At Altamira, bison so vivid that when they were first discovered in 1879, scholars refused to believe they could be prehistoric. The artistry was too good. The accusation of forgery lingered for over 2 decades before the scientific establishment accepted what the evidence demanded. These were not idle doodles. The locations, deep, difficult, dangerous to reach, suggest intentional, possibly ritual purpose. Some chambers show evidence of acoustic resonance, with paintings placed precisely where sounds echo most dramatically. Handprints, both positive and negative, appear on walls across dozens of sites spanning tens of thousands of years. Some of those hands belong to children. Some show missing fingers. Whether from frostbite, injury, or ritual amputation remains unknown. But they are unmistakably human, pressed against stone in the dark, saying something we can no longer hear. Bone flutes found at Hohl Fels in Germany date to over 40,000 years ago, carved from the wing bones of griffon vultures, making music one of the oldest documented human behaviors. The flutes are not crude. They have precisely spaced finger holes, producing pentatonic scales that are still recognizable as melodic. Someone sat in that cave and played notes that we could hum today. Burial sites from the same period contain flower pollen, ochre, shell beads, and carefully positioned bodies, evidence of grief, of ceremony, of belief in something beyond the visible. We do not know what they believed. We cannot reconstruct their myths or their cosmology with certainty, but the evidence points in a single, unmistakable direction. These were not people merely surviving. They were people making meaning. They decorated their bodies, adorned their dead, painted in the dark, and played music in the firelight. The inner life of a Paleolithic human was not a blank space waiting to be filled by civilization. It was already full. And then, roughly 12,000 years ago, the world changed. The climate warmed, ice sheets retreated, and in a handful of locations across the globe, the Fertile Crescent, the Yangtze River Valley, Mesoamerica, human groups began doing something unprecedented. They planted seeds, they penned animals, they stayed. The transition to agriculture was not a liberation. It was, by almost every physical metric, a catastrophe. Skeletal evidence from the earliest farming communities shows a dramatic decline in stature. In some regions, average height dropped by nearly 5 inches within a few generations. Dental cavities, virtually absent in forager populations, exploded as grain-heavy diets flooded mouths with starch. Anemia became widespread as dietary diversity collapsed from over 100 food sources to a handful of cultivated staples. Repetitive stress injuries appeared in the spine, knees, and arms from grinding grain hour after hour, day after day, season after season. The bones tell the story with brutal clarity. Farming made us shorter, sicker, and more worn. Workloads increased sharply. The 4 to 6 hours of forager subsistence became 10, 12, 14 hours of backbreaking agricultural labor. Leisure collapsed. Disease flourished in the crowded, sedentary settlements that farming demanded. Tuberculosis, as smallpox, measles, influenza, all products of proximity between humans and domesticated animals. The forager's world, mobile, egalitarian, leisured, diverse, was replaced by something harder, more stratified, more productive in aggregate but poorer in individual experience. Food surpluses created elites. Elites created hierarchies. Hierarchies created armies, taxes, laws, priests, and eventually the civilizations that would write the histories in which foragers appear as primitives to be pitied. The very people who invented writing used it first to record debts and rations, not poetry, not philosophy, but the bureaucratic machinery of control that the forager world had spent 300,000 years keeping at bay. The trade-off was profound. Agriculture gave us cities, writing, mathematics, medicine, philosophy, and every technology that defines the modern world. But it took something in return. It took the campfire. It took the afternoon nap. It took the 300 plant species known by name. It took the 2-hour workday and the evening spent in stories. It took a kind of freedom that no subsequent society has managed to reconstruct. We did not leave that world because it failed us. We left it because the world changed around us, and the new strategies that emerged were, in the long run, more powerful, even if they were not, for most people, more pleasant. The bones are still in the ground, the paintings are still on the walls, and somewhere in the gap between what we were